All right, guys, I'm going to go through the First Great Awakening with you really quickly so you can understand it for quiz number two. So, the First Great Awakening started in the 1740s, and it was a religious movement. So, the whole idea is around religion, 1740s. And the reason why this happened was because religion had gotten really, really stale in the colonies. The colonies, even the New England colonies, where religion was basically the whole focus for why it had been founded, it had become very, very formal and had lost a lot of people having interest in it. It didn't mean necessarily that people weren't Christians still, just their whole passion for church became very, very sterile. So there are these new preachers that came in, and these new preachers are going to really appeal to people's emotion. And this is actually something completely opposite of what the old preachers were doing. Old preachers felt like if you appealed to somebody's emotion, that you were actually kind of trying to disguise the word of God. And so because of that, the old preachers would actually talk in a very monotone, slow voice like this. And then the new preachers that came in, they came in and they spoke with all this inflection in their voice and all this emotion. And they told people that the most important thing didn't have to deal with your relationship with the church. It had to deal with your relationship with God. And that's going to be important because it's going to create more individualism. All right. And that's the big key of the First Great Awakening is it's an individual relationship. You may actually want to write down individual relationship in that last point because individualism is going to be a big thing in the First Great Awakening. These new preachers were called the New Lights. All right, now you need to know a couple of examples of these new preachers. So one of them is a guy named Jonathan Edwards, very well educated. He was from New England, and he wanted to go back to the intensity of the Puritan forefathers. All right, now his most famous sermon is called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And if you just read that sermon title, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, you can kind of think this is going to be a little bit of an intense sermon. And it was. He had an amazing vocabulary, and he used all these images of hell very often to describe why people needed to turn to God. I would say probably the closest thing we have like that, or if you've ever been to like a Falcons game or a big sporting event where people gather pre-COVID when we used to be able to gather closer than 6 feet apart. There are sometimes these preachers that are to say like turn or burn, like basically turn to God or burn in hell. And Jonathan Edwards kind of did that, but people were drawn to it because of the emotion and the visual language that he used. Now, he was very popular, but the most popular guy is George Whitefield. And I know it's spelled like George Whitefield, but it's actually pronounced George Whitefield. And we call him Touchdown Jesus. And the reason why we call him Touchdown Jesus is if you look at this picture, this is George Whitefield. And this guy must have used his hands to talk more than any other person on earth. Like, I am somebody who I use my hands to talk a lot. And George Whitefield must have used his tenfold of mine because every picture we have of him have his hands up in the air. Now, one important distinction between Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield is that George Whitefield was from England, so he wasn't from the colonies, but he came over to the colonies and had an incredibly successful revival all over the place. And he preached to all classes. He even got people who were somewhat skeptic of this emotional appeal, such as Benjamin Franklin, to pour all of his money into an offering plate. All right, so last thing, the effects of the Great Awakening. So the first major effect, again, is this idea that there's more individual faith in God, not so much about an outward expression of faith in the church. And again, why that's important is people are going to be thinking more about individualism. And there's a reason why. I'll tell you about that in just a second. Number two, there's a huge surge of colleges that are going to be started because there's going to be all these new types of churches that are going to pop up, different denominations. A huge important thing is this is when the colonies begin to form their own unique American identity. And that identity is going to be more rooted in the church than in England. And that's continued still to this day. Our churches are much more popular in America than they are in England and Europe today. If you ever go over to Europe, they have a ton of churches, but if you go there on Sunday or if you go there on their holy day, they're very rarely filled. Our churches are much more filled, and that's a unique American thing. And the separation of those two ideas starts with the Second Great Awakening, the importance of religion in our society. Finally, it's going to encourage this equality and the right to challenge authority. There was this old established group, the Old Lights, and people rejected that old light, and they wanted to have a new group of people come in, and they wanted to have that new group cater to what they wanted. So therefore, the reason why I've been expressing individual faith so much is because this led to democratic thought, all right? Democratic thought, if you don't know this, you may just want to write this out to the side. It's the ability to choose. Democracy is all about choice. You got to choose between, do you want to go to your old church or do you want to go to these new churches that are popping up? And if you got to choose what church you go to, why don't you get to choose your government? Why is there just a king that's established? So because of that, overall, people's ability to choose are going to cause for them to want more choice in government, which is eventually going to lead to revolution.